Hi everyone. So today is the lecture on biological anthropology. So I think I mentioned this like when we started talking about on the lecture what is anthropology. We did an overview of like the four subfields, so cultural, biological, archaeology, and linguistics. So I'm just going to do a little bit more on bio, and I know I mentioned this before that there's often a link, even when we're talking about the cultural aspects, there's often a link to some biological factors as well. So I just want us to go a little bit deeper into the biological part. Now, I know I mentioned this before that I think I have a couple of you in this course who are also in my 102 course. So you're going to get some of this twice, but I mean that's fine because like the more you hear it, the more like you'll learn it, so it's fine. And I know we did go over this a little bit on that initial PowerPoint. What is anthropology? So this is kind of an extension. In fact, I think I even have some of the same bullet points, some of the same pictures. So this is just expanding on that a little bit. So nothing that we do here today should be completely new. I'm just kind of expanding on what I talked about before. But like I said, just goes into a little bit more detail. Okay. So just like before, you see me, I have my PowerPoint to the side, and this is a fairly short one. I know I said that on a previous one, and then I still ended up talking for like 45 minutes, so it depends. Okay, it depends on what I think of during the lecture, how many tangents I want to go on. Because like if we were in class, I'd be looking at the clock, like, oh, I don't really have time, but here, like I could talk for 2 hours, But I don't want to sit here and do that. But sometimes I know I get into it, and I keep wanting to talk. Okay, anyway, just like now. Okay, so slide 2. Okay, so biological, and then in parentheses it says physical anthropology. So I'm pretty sure I mentioned this to you guys before. Now I asked my students last semester this, and then also when I was looking, when I like got my assigned courses this semester, CSN still has this class as physical anthropology. But physical anthropology and biological, it's the same thing. It means the same thing. Physical anthropology is kind of an older term. When I first started taking anthropology courses, like a decade ago or so, it was biological. But you could, even in different, it depends on the university, it depends on the instructor. And just like our, for those of you who are in the 102 class, or for those of you who might be interested in taking it, when you take the class, the textbook is like essentials in biological anthropology. So just know like bio and physical, it means the same thing. It's just that same subfield of anthropology. So here I have some of the subfields, and just like before, like I said, this is kind of a little bit of a repeat of what we talked about on that initial what is anthropology lecture in PowerPoint. So here I have osteology, paleo, forensic, primatology, evolutionary behavior. So there are many more, and if you take the bio course, we expand on that a bit, and we go into way more detail than I'm giving you guys here. So this is the intro to cultural course. Like I said, as we go through this course, there's going to be a lot of biological things that we talk about. Like we're going to talk about some primate stuff, or we're going to talk about some evolution stuff, because we can't separate the cultural processes from the fact that we are humans, we are primates, we are mammals. There's an evolutionary process going on with us biologically, and there's also an evolutionary process culturally. So we really have to talk about these so some of these things make sense to you. And even in the bio course, well, I pull in some cultural stuff too. So those two things, it's really hard to separate them. In fact, you often cannot. I would argue that there are multiple things that are biologically based there is no cultural influence for sure. And some would even argue, and I probably am repeating myself to you guys, but some would argue that even culture isn't really a separate thing from biological anthropology. It's really just an extension of our biological experience. So we might get a chance to go into that in more detail way later in the semester, but like don't hold me to that, because it always depends on like what how much we get through. And anyway, okay. So I'm pretty sure I have a slide for each of these, so let's move on. So slide 3, osteology. So just like before, we talked about this, and like I said, this is just going to be more detail. So osteology, what can you learn from the skeleton? Just by looking at the bones, there's so much you can know about the individual. So here I have a list and bullet points. Stature, ancestry, age, sex, pathology, taphonomy. So I know taphonomy wasn't on the initial one when I talked about it. So taphonomy is just like what are the processes occurring on those bones, like once they've been in the ground, for example. Are bugs getting to them? Is dirt and maybe tree roots doing something to them? Are animals like scavengers coming along and gnawing on the bones? Like you can tell that. But there's a lot you can tell about the individual just based on the bones. like we talked about before, the height of someone. You don't need the entire skeleton to know their height. If you have just one bone, if you have the femur, you can get within like a couple centimeters, pretty good estimate. Even with arms in the bones in the arms, you can still tell within. It's the error, the margin of error is a little larger, but you can still tell. And you can see here I have some pictures. There is the picture of the hand, so you can see all the bones in the hand. You can see that individual, like human, the whole skeleton and the different parts. But there's also a picture down here on the bottom. So it's a pelvis on the left and a pelvis on the right, or two pelvies. So pelvis is plural for pelvis. And this is how we can determine sex. So we can determine sex using the pelvis. We can also determine it using the skull. And if you take the bio course with me, we go into that in fine detail. And if you take the lab course associated with that, you get a really cool hands-on experience. So I don't teach the lab at CSN, but I do teach the lab course at UNLV, and like it's a lot of fun because hands-on. Well, with everything right now being remote, at least at UNLV, it's not hands-on this semester. So I'm not teaching it there this semester, but I can imagine it's going to be a little more difficult. Anyway, side note. Okay, so if you're looking at this picture, two pelvies, one on the left and one on the right, and if I said to you one of them is male and one of them is female, would you be able to tell which? Now, if you've never had this, like, if you've never had this, like, in a course before, maybe you, like, I don't even know what to base it on, but maybe you do, and maybe even if you haven't seen this before, if you just, commonsensically were to look at it and maybe think about it, you might be able to figure it out. So, take a second, pause the video, think about it. So I'll tell you the answer. The one on the left is the male, the one on the right is the female, and there are a bunch of different ways you can tell. Now, you can't see what I'm seeing, but I'll just kind of describe to you. So, like, in general, when you look at the width or the angle of expanse of like those blades, so like the ilium of the pelvis, they're wider in the female. There were also, like, pretty much, I know you're only seeing like a two-dimensional picture, so it's harder, but basically anywhere you look and compare the two where it's larger, bigger, wider, more of an opening, that's going to indicate that that's female. Now, these are examples of, what we would say like hypermasculine, hyperfeminine. Not every female has the same shaped pelvis. Obviously, like, that's not something I need to tell you guys. Not every male has the same shaped pelvis. There's going to be a little bit of variation within either sex, but those two are distinct from each other. But like I said, like, there's always, we talked about this before with variation, or did we? Was that the other class? Well, I'll tell you now. Variation in human, whether we're talking about biological or cultural variation, is going to play a big role. There's always going to be variation. That's just the way nature works. So even if you're like all females have a wide pelvis, wide pelvic inlet, wide greater sciatic notch, whatever it is, bigger, wider, more spaced out. With it, if you look at all the females, some are going to be a little bit more, a little bit less, there's going to be a little bit of variation. But in general, as a group, females will have all of these features in comparison to the males. Okay. Slide 4. My thing's acting up. Okay, so you can see here on the side, there's some pictures showing like what bone looks like under a microscope. It's kind of cool. If you take an osteology course, you really get into like how bone grows, how it repairs itself, when there's like an injury. That's always really interesting. What are the kind of the age-related processes that often occur in bones related to like certain types of vitamin or vitamin deficiencies. So you can see here is a picture of, is that osteoporosis? Sorry, like, it's, I had to like get really close to it. So osteoporosis, yes. And in fact, I'll tell you guys, so I know I mentioned this when I did the introductions, that this is going to come up, that my history with having cancer. So like, this is a pertinent thing. So I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and my breast cancer was estrogen positive. There are different types. If you're not familiar with the type, like, it's not a big deal, it doesn't matter. You'll still understand what I'm going to tell you. So there are different types. Mine is what's known as estrogen positive. So the good thing about that is that it's a very common type, which means there's a lot of research behind it. So they knew, my oncologist, she knew, like, the course of treatment was very standardized, because it was a well-known type, and the treatment is very standardized, and there's a lot of research behind it. I had like a 92% chance of, being totally fine if I just did the treatment. So like, really good odds. But because it's estrogen positive, we had to get my body to stop producing estrogen, because if the cancer were to reoccur, the cancer feeds on the estrogen. So we want to eliminate any food resource for the cancer. So we had to stop my body from producing estrogen. Now, I was 34 when I was diagnosed. And when they started me on estrogen blockers, that was like the first thing, because like, you know, how it goes with insurance, they had to get insurance approval to get me like on starting chemotherapy. That all happened pretty quickly, but it was about 3 weeks. And she's like, let's do something right now. Let's stop the estrogen in your body right now. And then when chemo starts, you know. And then of course we're going through chemo. For those of you who aren't aware, as a woman, chemo basically kills your menstrual cycle. You don't get, it's very rare, but you often do not get a period when you're going through chemotherapy. So she said, you know, you're not going to get it while you're going through chemotherapy. And it was a small chance that it would just never come back, just because as a side effect of chemo. But she told me, she's like, you know, if it comes back, she's like, it probably will. After you've done chemo and surgery and radiation, we're going to put you back on those estrogen blockers, because just as like preemptive, like they got all the cancer out with the surgery, and then I went through radiation after that to, you know, make sure that it killed every minuscule part of it. But they still have me on estrogen blockers. This is a long story, guys, sorry. But anyway, so the point of this relating to what we're talking about is estrogen blockers. Essentially, I'm in menopause so I started going through this process at about age 35, which is, you know, not a natural time. It's very rare for it to happen naturally at that young of an age. I think the average in the US is like, oh man, someone Google it. I want to say it's like 51, the average age of menopause. I Googled that like probably 2 years ago. Anyway, obviously I was significantly younger, and it was like an artificial, like it was, you know, medication induced, although I am like, that is what's occurring. And so I've had the whole thing, like all like the hot flashes, which are, I asked my doctor, like, what does that feel like? And she described it to me, and I was like, okay, that doesn't sound so bad. Now, it's not like, believe me, out of all the things I've gone through in the last 3 years, it is not even close to being the worst thing I experienced, but it's definitely a unique experience. I remember being in Target, and I started having a hot flash, and I was like, oh God. And I had to go to the freezer section and like put half of my head, like, and like basically from the chest up into one of the freezer sections, and just stand there for a good like 2 minutes, because I just was like, I'm gonna die. I can't breathe. Like it's like your head is suddenly in an oven. Like it's intense. So now, like at my house, because I still get them, I have like a bunch of ice packs, and I have like, the females or some of the males might know, like if you get like those masks with like the little beads, and you put it in the freezer, it's supposed to like depuff. Like I have that, and I like put it on my face when I'm having a hot flash, because it's like, oh my God. But anyway, the point of this is that one of the more extreme side effects of being in menopause is bone loss, osteoporosis, and sometimes even things like rheumatoid arthritis, like a lot of bone issues. And so because of that, I'm on like a calcium plus vitamin D supplement. But I just recently, I've been having a lot of pain in my bones, like a lot. And so I had to go in for a bone scan about 5 days ago, which was just very similar to an x-ray, but like wasn't painful. Not like the stuff I used to have done. But they want to know like how bad it is. Like it's assumed there's bone loss. Like it's just an assumption because of I'm actually on, so they started me on one estrogen blocker, and it stopped working. I started getting a period after about 6 months of being on it. And so the doctor was like, we got to switch you to the more extreme medication. And on top of that, I'm on like a monthly shot. So I've got like, you know, my body's just going through it right now. But anyway, so she's like, it's assumed there's probably bone loss. We just don't know how much or how extreme. Because of course they don't want me to get the cancer again, but they also don't want me to like fall and break a hip at like, you know, 38. So anyway, I probably will tell you guys what ends up happening with that bone scan and how bad it is. But anyway, so like this is something that I'm kind of having to deal with, and thinking about like, you know, the bone structure, like our bones, like when you're young, you don't really think about the inner workings of your body. Like typically you don't really think about those inner workings of your body. And I'll tell you, like, cause I'm kind of at that age where, like, cancer aside, I'm definitely at the age where you're starting to feel like, oh God, I'm getting old, like late 30s. And you're like, oh, I slept wrong. And then it throws off everything for the whole week, cause you're like, this one little muscle in your neck or your back is all, you know, screwed up. And just like little things like, you know, you just get more tired and things hurt. You know, you're like going to stand up from the couch, you're like, oh, my hips, you know. So I'm already kind of at that point just in life, and then throw this into it, it's just making a lot worse. But so I doubt my bones like that's kind of an extreme example. I doubt it's that bad, but I don't know. Whenever I have work done or like scans and stuff, I try to get a copy of it. And if you're in my bio class, you'll know that on my PowerPoints, throughout the semester, you'll see a lot of my own scans because they're kind of cool. So I'll show you guys those, and it'd be cool to have like throw that in here at some point if like the bone scan is available. Anyway, see, this is what I said. This was going to be a short PowerPoint, and I just spent 10 minutes talking about this. Anyway, but if you saw someone's bones that looked like that, you would know, like, maybe they're, like, you have to look at the rest of the skeleton, but you could say, okay, they're probably older, and or they had a vitamin deficiency of some sort, they were on some kind of medication. That's going to tell you a lot about that individual. Okay, moving on. Slide 5. Paleoanthropology. So I said this before, I am a paleoanthropologist. A sub category, obviously, of biological anthropology. So we study hominins, if you recall. I even drew the little picture on the board. Hominins are everything in the human lineage since our split with chimpanzees. Now, it's not everything in that lineage is a direct ancestor of humans, but everything's kind of direct and or indirect, because of course there were some like evolutionary offshoots that eventually died out. But paleoanthropologists study that, you know, grouping. And like I have here, early hominins, so stuff right after the split with chimpanzees, like right after our lineage kind of went bipedal. Some paleoanthropologists will study those. Many will study Australopithecines. So my advisor, he studies Australopithecines and Paranthropines. That's, you know, like 3 to 4 million years ago. He does some early Homo stuff. And then of course there's like later, like our genus Homo, or like early Homo, later Homo. So you might do like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, Heidelbergensis, Homo heidelbergensis. So like I have this tattooed, so you can't even see it. Rotate my arm. Okay, that's not a good one. Okay, hopefully you saw it. So I study Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthal stuff, and sometimes modern humans kind of throw it in there, and like apes in general. I study. So it really depends on like what you as a scientist or paleoanthropologist find interesting. Do you find, you know, like the more recent stuff more interesting? Do you find the earlier stuff? Like it really depends. And sometimes you have like an area where you're like, I just really enjoy like learning about bipedalism. So you might kind of look at maybe throughout the lineage to kind of see the changes. It really depends. And then, you know, per the last bullet point, some like to focus on like modern human stuff. So like, but the emergence of Homo sapiens, like, you know, a few 100,000 years ago, like how did we kind of start evolving? What were the changes? What were the precursors to Homo sapiens, like in our like different species, you know? So some like to look at that. Paleoanthropologists do not look at like modern, like, you know, 2020. Like we don't look at those kind of humans. It's usually earlier stuff. Now you might compare it, like if we have, you know, x-rays or CT scans from a bunch of humans from like 50 years ago, we might use those in research to say, okay, this represents the human data. And then I have collected data on like, you know, some other hominins and primates or whatever, and then I can use those to compare. But there's never like a research focus often. It's more rare to have a research focus as a paleoanthropologist on like modern humans without some kind of contrast to another hominid. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so you can see here in the picture, there are 2 skulls. If I told you one of those is a Homo sapien and one of those is a Neanderthal or Homo neanderthalensis, would you be able to tell me which one was which? I'll tell you. The one on the left is the Homo sapien. The one on the right is the Neanderthal. Oh, real quick before I move on with that. Also, it's Neanderthal with a T, Neanderthal. Sometimes you will see it spelled with just the T. Sometimes you will see it spelled with a TH. It doesn't matter. It's Neanderthal. Please, I know we're not interacting in person, but if there ever is the chance that we do not say Neanderthal. That is completely wrong. It's Neanderthal. I don't know why people say it that way. I think people say it that way who have never heard it said correctly, and so they read it, which, like, I get it has a TH, but that's not how you say it. It's Neanderthal. So if you hear someone say it wrong, you'd be like, that's wrong, the correct way. Neanderthal. Okay. But if you look at those 2 skulls, you might be thinking, okay, like I see some clear differences, but I also see a lot of similarities, and this is true. So some similarities, you know, like in the face structure, brain size. So how many times can I say so? Neanderthals actually, out of all the hominins, since our split with chimps to modern humans, all those different species, Neanderthals have the biggest brain, bigger than human on average, Homo sapien on average. Homo sapiens is like 1350 cubic centimeters or cc's, and Neanderthal I think averages like 1500 cc's. So on average, it's significantly larger, and you can see that in the picture. Like they have a bigger brain, but also they were a little bigger and stockier in general, so that kind of makes sense. Like obviously, there's this weird, and not weird because I understand why historically, but there's a lot of like earlier on when they were finding Neanderthal bones, there were a lot of stories that got told about them. They were completely incorrect, that the popular culture kind of hung on to that Neanderthals are stupid or probably didn't have language, barely could, start a fire. Like all this stuff is kind of absurd because we know, like, well, one, they had a large brain, and a large brain compared to their body. So we call this EQ, or encephalization quotient, that when you look at the size of the brain compared to the size of the body, that tells you a lot. Because you could have any animal with a bigger brain than humans, but is their body bigger? Like obviously, like if you're looking at like a whale, you're like, obviously a whale has a large brain because it's a larger animal. So you always want to look at the brain compared to the body size and see like what that ratio is, and that'll tell you a lot about that species, like cognitively. But also we have like physical evidence of Neanderthals, like art that they drew, clothing that they wore, jewelry that they made, a lot of symbolic stuff. So like for this class, this is important. We'll talk about this. Like when you have this more complex symbolism, not just like they obviously had tools and weapons, not even just that, which we can see in other animals like chimpanzees, for example, where they're creating tools and weapons to use. That's definitely culture. But also when you start having more symbolic nature, that is incredible. And then of course we have like Neanderthal burial sites where they buried their dead and decorated the burials and put like grave goods, put items in the grave. Like this is the first, like Neanderthals are the first, so far that what we've seen, the evidence is showing that Neanderthals are the first species to do this before Homo sapiens. Or about the same time as Homo sapiens. This is all kind of happening around the same time, contemporaneously. But Neanderthals absolutely had that aspect to them as a group. Okay, so moving on. Slide 6. So you do not need to know any of that. I'm just giving you like a general idea. These are like the different species that you might study, like the early genera. You don't need to know this. If you're taking the bio course, maybe you'd have to know some of this. But even then, I'm not gonna I know it looks really overwhelming. You're like, I don't even know how to say those. For this class, I'm just giving you a very general idea that there are multiple species in different points in time that different paleoanthropologists study. And you can see here some of the more famous ones. Like we have a Homo erectus skull. You can see that giant brow ridge. Another Homo erectus skeleton, a very famous one. Fairly complete. In fact, we have a replica in our paleo lab at UNLV. It's pretty cool looking. Let's see, slide 7. Okay, still on paleo. So I wanted to show you a little bit about what I do, like how I collect data. So there's a process called geometric morphometrics. It's a very fancy way of saying like we look at like shape and like in a three-dimensional sense, and the evolutionary implications of like shape change and understanding like shape space, and how to analyze things three-dimensionally and how that's important. So like even when you look at a lot of earlier work in like in physical biological anthropology, especially paleo, and even sometimes like an intro, like when you take the lab course, you'll probably use like calipers and a bone bore to measure, and like getting linear measurements is totally fine. It's a really good place to start. But obviously you can imagine something like the skull, if you're just getting like this point to this point or this point to this point, like that might tell you a little bit, like, okay, the width or the length of the skull could be important, but you're missing all of these other details and expanse. It's like, how is the brain expanding in this way or that way? Like in every little detail, how do you get that information to compare it, to look at evolutionary trends? Obviously looking at this in 3 dimensions is a much better method. And so this is what we do. So you can see here on the picture on the top right, it's a skull. It's got all these little dots. So this is a screenshot I took. So when I'm working in some of the software, I literally will take the same points in like I take like say like 80 points, analogous points, on each skull, and I might look like 300 skulls. So it's like click, 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 click. Same order too. And then I put all that in an Excel spreadsheet, and each point the software will give me like an XYZ coordinate. And there's a lot of other fancy stuff I can do in the statistics so I have it listed here, principal components, and procrustes analysis and some other stuff. And the software's going to do a bunch of fancy stuff. Basically, at the end, you get like a real true comparison in 3 dimensions of what's going on. It's going to tell you, okay, you're seeing some major differences in like the expanse, like in this very particular area. And you can even see here in this picture in the bottom, like in the middle, there's a few different softwares that I use, but in one of them, you can see where I've collected the points, like it has the numbers. And hopefully you can kind of see, it's like 2-dimensional on this one. That's actually a chimpanzee skull from the side. You can see there's like the head, and then like the little brow ridge, and then like the face, because there's no mandible. It's just like the top. And then of course there's a picture of a graph. Like this little slide doesn't do it justice what we do. But just understand that it's a more complex way of getting at more complex evolutionary questions. So this is what I do. It's a little tedious, but I enjoy that part. Everyone wants a little bit of that, and then some more, interesting, complex stuff in the end. But I like it because I can ask more complex questions about like anatomically, morphologically what's going on. So that's pretty cool. Okay. Slide 8. Forensic anthropology. Most of you are familiar with this. Like, I know I said this before, like if you've seen the show Bones, they get it right sometimes, but it's still TV. It's not always correct. There's a lot of stuff that's not correct. There's also plenty of shows about forensic, like Forensic Files. Like pretty much any show you watch, like Dateline, any of those shows will have forensics either being a major component of the show, or like they'll definitely talk about it, like in terms of like if there's a trial, they like bring in the forensic person. But forensic anthropology, so when you're, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned this before too, like forensic anthropology versus like archaeology or bioarchaeology, it's usually like 50 years, give or take, is the threshold. Like if you find a skull, like say that skull in that picture, say someone found that skull, they're like, oh wow, that person looks like they've maybe been shot or something. Looks like that, it might have been intentional in some way. If you were able to determine that individual is like 400 years old, that's not really a criminal investigation anymore. You can't prosecute that person. That person who did it is long gone. But if you were like, say you were able to determine that person maybe that crime happened 10 years ago, well then you can, maybe find the person who did it, or even 20, 30, 40 years ago. So that's why I say 50 is the cutoff, because usually anything after that, it gets a little more difficult, especially if it's like way longer, way further back than that. But it's not always about like criminal investigations. So you can see here in the bullet points I have if there are natural disasters. So this happens often. A natural disaster like a major flood or a fire, hurricane, and it comes in and might disturb like a cemetery, and you have to call in the forensic anthropologist to kind of figure out who's who and all that, because you might just have like, if there's a flood or something and a bunch of bodies, and like maybe it's like an older cemetery from maybe like 100 years ago or something, and a lot of the coffins are going to be wood, and then the flood comes and suddenly you just have a bunch of bones. You don't really know who went to who. Maybe you have some records, you probably do, of like age and sex and stuff. You might be able to like figure out who's who, but you have to have someone who has the training to be like, this is from a female, this is from a male, this is from a female who's only probably in their early 20s versus in their 50s. So you would need someone who's trained in that. And then also with like fires, similar, but natural disasters are often called in to help. Or sometimes even for during times of war, if there are times when there are like mass graves and they need someone to come and help and identify who's who, kind of separate people out. So it can be difficult, I can imagine, like emotionally, but very, very much needed and amazing work that forensic anthropologists do. Okay, so slide 9, primatology. So it's in the name, study of primates. Humans are primates. We are apes, we are primates. Typically primatologists, though, have a focus on non-human primates. They will often compare them to humans, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's just a sole focus on, maybe they're looking at, for the picture, they're looking at lemurs. Maybe their focus is on other apes. Maybe their focus is on, New World or Old World monkeys, or, they might look at, so per the bullet points, they might look at like classification systems, like how understanding ancestry, how they're related. They might be looking at locomotion. So are they bipedal or quadrupedal, or are they brachiators? Do they use vertical clinging and leaping? What is their mode of kind of moving about in the world, and what does it say about like their morphology and their anatomy, like the musculoskeletal system, and how that's all structured very differently because of that. Social behavior is a big one. I think I might, there's a couple of videos coming up in one of my PowerPoints where I will show you guys some cool, well, I won't show you, hopefully you click on the link, some really cool videos on some primate stuff, but social behavior and or intelligence and things like that is a huge point of research for primatologists. We often have this idea, so going back to this idea we talked about ethnocentrism, think about it in terms of like different species, that we have a bias as humans. We're like, well, humans are clearly better than other species. Humans are smarter, we're better at this, we're better at that. That is not accurate. Now, we might be better at certain things for sure. Every species is interesting and unique in their own way, but it doesn't make one of them better or worse than another. But there's still often the argument of like humans, and this is the other thing about, we've tried to separate ourselves from animals, from other animals for so long. First it was, well, humans have, we make tools that separates us from the rest of animals. Well, then we started seeing other apes are clearly doing that in some very complex ways. Then another argument was, well, humans, we have language, so that separates us. And now what we're realizing is that there are other animals, like clearly animals communicate vocally in some way, but the argument was always, well, humans have more like complex language. But now we're realizing that with a lot of studies like on dolphins and other apes, that might not be accurate. And then of course there's always the argument like humans have culture, this cultural experience that other animals just don't have. But now we're realizing like that's not accurate either. Like especially when we're looking at other apes, they clearly have the ability to create tools and weapons. They have the ability to pass on information from generation to generation that is not innate or natural, that instinctual. It has to be taught to them, and that's culture. So like I said, we're always trying to separate humans. Like, well, we're separate, we're different, we're better for this reason or this reason. Every time we come up with a reason, we realize it's not accurate. So you need to get that bias out of your mind. Like, yes, Homo sapiens we're unique and interesting in some ways. Like, for example, we are bipedal. Bipedalism amongst animals is more rare. Plenty of other animals are. You might say, well, we have a really big brain compared to our body size. That's true. But there's a lot of research into this, looking at other animals like dolphins. EQ is either the same or higher than ours. And other animals are almost as smart if we're using that as the gauge, like our brain size to body size ratio. So like, I mean, the list goes on. So just think about that. Think about that idea. That it's not that clear cut that we are just like in some separate category. We are an animal. Like I said, we are an ape. We are a primate. So all these like evolutionary processes that we're going to talk about apply to us. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Slide 10. Just more on primatology. I think I already said this. Okay, so like classification, taxonomy, looking at those traits, behaviors, so like diet and social structure. So there's a lot of research into like the diet that they're eating, what types. This is often a misconception that, and I think I'll talk about this a little bit later on in another PowerPoint. Very few primates are meat eaters. It's rare, like to eat another animal. Now there are quite a few who eat insects, so they're still eating like an animal, but not like in the same, not like a rabbit or something like that, but still eating animals. So many are insectivores, but eating other mammals or something is extremely rare. The majority of primates eat plants, and this is for whatever reason a misconception. I know the reason, because of the large canine amongst primates, and we will talk about this later in the semester. When you want to know what a primate is eating, other non-primates, different story. But when you want to know what a primate is eating, you want to look at their molars or their back teeth. The canine has nothing to do with what a primate is eating. The large canine among primates has to do with something completely different. It has to do with something social. and I don't want to, I'll go off on a tangent right now, so we'll get into that later. Just so you know, when you see like a primate with a large canine, it does not mean that they eat meat. People think, oh, don't gorillas eat meat? No, gorillas do not eat meat. Gorillas eat leaves and bark and not the best stuff. Like I said, I don't want to give you guys the whole PowerPoint. I'm going to give you like in 2 weeks, so we're going to talk about that. Okay. Slide 11. Oh, real quick, before slide 10, I'll go back. I wanted to say something. The last bullet point, sexual dimorphism. I think I mentioned that in this class already. But if I haven't, I'm going to mention it now. It's going to be a point of importance for this class. And it's a huge point in this class and in the 102. I talk about this point a lot. Sexual dimorphism is the difference between males and females in the same species based on either size, shape, or color. So if you look at birds, often you'd see, okay, they're the same general size, but one bird is either male or female is very colorful. Typically, which one it is the male or the female? Think about it. It's often the male. This is true for primates. Not all primates have a color difference. Some do. Some species. A really good example is like the mandrill. I don't have that on the PowerPoint. If you Google that mandrill, it's one of my favorite. Very, very beautiful primate. Major color differences. The male has this very bright coloring on its snout. Others have like some major color differences in their hair color. But often when we see sexual dimorphism in primates, it's usually a size or shape difference. So I do have a picture of that. So if you look at the picture of the orangutan, you see like the male and the female. Guess which one's the male and which one's the female. When you have a size difference, it's always the male who is larger. We'll talk about that. What this means evolutionarily, what this means, like even culturally for humans, what this means. Because humans, we are also a sexually dimorphic species. Not as extreme as the orangutan or like a gorilla, with like the males can often be twice the size. But it's very similar to like a chimpanzee, where there's a clear size difference between males and females. Osteologically, morphologically, there's a clear difference because of puberty and the processes that our bodies go through because of that. Like I said, I don't want to go on too many tangents with that, but just like put a star next to it, think about that this is a point we're going to talk about later in the semester or throughout the semester. Okay, so slide 11, you'll just see, so I said the word locomotion earlier, and I think I said those like quadrupedal, vertical clinging and leaping, brachiation, bipedalism, so you can see those, how that's going to change, how an individual moves about in the world, how that's going to completely adjust their skeletal structure, but of course their muscles, even organs, how that's going to completely change that. Okay, slide 12, evolutionary behavior. Oh my gosh, I just saw. I've been talking for 37 minutes. I'm sorry, guys. I was like, oh, 13 slides. I'll be done in like 20 minutes. And then I go on a million tangents. Okay. Evolutionary behavior. So I know I talked about this one before as well. So this is just looking at the reasons why, from an evolutionary perspective, why humans do certain behaviors, whether it comes to like reproductive decisions, when it comes to like how we treat like family members and so some of those words here, look, I'm not going to get too much detail on this because this is something we focus on more in the bio course, but things like kin selection or fitness, like how many offspring you have, what that means for you evolutionarily, what is your behavior towards family when the resources are high, when resources are low, as a male or female, your behaviors will be different based, some differences based on evolutionary adaptations. But also like pathology. So pathology is a big one. So like looking at things like psychopathy or sociopathy from an evolutionary perspective. And so, like I said before, if you take like a Psych 101 class, you'll spend a little time on this. And like I would say, most human behavior, even when it's extreme, most human behavior, if not all, can be explained from an evolutionary basis in some way. When I started my master's program, mine was focused on evolutionary behavior to a degree, and it's fascinating. In fact, when I came to start my PhD, I started out back in 2015, I started working on a project focusing on evolutionary behavior. To me, it's very interesting. you know, life happens sometimes, and I ended up changing for the better. I think that I've really found my home like in paleoanthropology. And when I was doing my undergrad, it was all focused on paleo, so I kind of made the switch, and then I kind of went back to like, I was like, oh, paleo, it's my home, you know. But I still have this part of this, like everything about like what we call like evolutionary behavior, evolutionary psychology, or ev psych. I'm like, oh, it's so good. In fact, there is, as a complete side note, there is a really good show on Netflix called Mindhunters. And of course, like there's been 2 seasons and it's really good. Of course, they're like not going to. I heard they're not going to do a 3rd season, but they go into a little bit about like some of this indirectly. It's more about like psychopaths, and like it's like about the FBI, like in the 70s and the 80s when they started getting into like understanding behavior from like a psychological perspective in terms of like what these individuals like serial killers were doing. But they touch on I think a little bit of the evolutionary stuff, but not much. But it just reminded me of it. So like you have my like personal recommendations. If you're like, I need a show to binge watch. It's a little intense at points. It's about serial killers, but it's really good. And slide 13. Okay, slide 13, I just threw in like a few things about archaeology, but that's really not going to come up in this class, so you can just kind of look at those, and this is the only time it's ever going to come up, so don't worry about that. And that's it. Sorry, it took longer than I thought it always does. Sometimes even the long PowerPoints, I'm like, oh, this is going to be long, and then it's like shorter. I don't know how that happens. Okay, so at 41 minutes, I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.